Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the incredibly complex, often tense intersection of higher education, religious identity, and family expectations for young Muslim women. And we're going to be pulling from a really fascinating mix of sources. We've got official theological statements, academic journals, but also some deeply personal, raw stories from blog posts and Reddit threads. It's a real journey into the delicate balancing act faced by those living in the diaspora. So let's get into it. You're going to medical. If not medical, then nothing. Now, imagine hearing that from your dad. That heartbreaking ultimatum is right at the center of our source material today. It comes directly from a young woman who was desperately seeking advice on the r/hijabi subreddit. She's just a year away from university admissions, and her father dropped this massive roadblock right in front of her. Just think about that for a second. Having all of your ambitions, all your dreams, narrowed down to one single, incredibly high-pressure path with the absolute threat of having your education cut off entirely if you don't make it. To truly understand the gravity of her situation, you have to picture the highly restricted world she lives in. She describes growing up in a conservative suburban town where she rarely leaves the house without permission, and she strictly observes modesty rules, wearing loose black abayas and hijabs. She's deeply obedient. But the real kicker here, the details she shared online, is that her initial goal actually was to study medicine. But by turning it into a completely forced ultimatum, her father stripped away her autonomy. She wants to study computer science now, but she feels completely trapped. And to make matters even more complicated, her mother, who is highly educated and actually turned down a university teaching position herself, now insists that women simply belong at home. And this perfectly highlights the stark contrast we found across our sources. On one hand, you have this highly restrictive environment described by the Reddit poster, where her own mother believes education is totally unnecessary for women. But contrast that household's view with actual institutional theological instructions. For instance, the worldwide head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community explicitly states that women can absolutely work professionally. We're talking doctors, teachers, lawyers, and yes, even engineers, provided they observe modesty. So you see this massive, glaring gap between a specific family's cultural enforcement and official religious doctrine. Part 1. Fearing the outside world. Let's unpack exactly why parents like these might be so terrified of letting their daughters out into that world. So the crucial thing to realize is that her parents' extreme restrictions are rooted in a deeply ingrained fear of secular assimilation. As the poster writes on Reddit, her parents are utterly convinced that the very second she steps onto a university campus, she's going to abandon her hijab and just fall into absolute moral corruption. For them, this isn't just about controlling a career path. In their eyes, it's literally about saving her soul from a society they view as fundamentally degrading. Taking a step back and looking at the academic perspective, research from the Journal of International Women's Studies gives us some fascinating broader context on this mindset. The author explores how Muslim communities in the diaspora don't just hide from Western culture. They actually use formal and cultural education as a shield. They recognize that to survive and to maintain their identity in a challenging environment, they actively have to understand the dominant culture they're living in, which leads to a really complex dynamic. Higher education is actually highly encouraged by religious leaders, but strictly as a tool for preservation. It's essentially a three-pronged strategy. First, cultural adjustment. You need to understand the West to defend against it. Second, enlightened motherhood. You educate women so they can solidly anchor the next generation in the faith. And third, proselytization, arming women with advanced knowledge so they can confidently preach and defend the faith using logic. It's an incredibly strategic, purposeful view of higher learning. In fact, to avoid that secular influence entirely during those super vulnerable early years, the sources reveal that religious leaders occasionally advise homeschooling. In one broadcast, the Ahmadiyya Khalifa advised that if parents have a high threshold for patience, and let's be real, teaching your own kids requires a lot of it, they should focus on building a strong moral and religious base at home first. Only after that foundation is completely rock solid should they transition the child over to formal schooling. Part 2. Faith, Women, and Education. Let's dive a little deeper into the official theological stance on women's education, which might honestly surprise you if you only know the perspective of the parents from that Reddit post. What's really fascinating here is how actively leadership pushes back against the narrative that their faith oppresses women. In an address to over 1,700 women and girls, the worldwide head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community condemned that Western criticism directly. He stated that Islam enshrined equality centuries ago, and that a woman's fundamental rights, like her right to her own dowry and, crucially, her right to an education, are firmly locked into the theology. So the takeaway here is that women aren't just allowed to be educated. They are actively commanded to attain higher education so they can step up as moral leaders. They're expected to guide their children, sure, but also to engage with the media, refute false allegations, and confidently defend their beliefs in the public sphere. It is a massive departure from the stay at home and do nothing mandate that our Reddit poster is currently fighting against. Part 3, Guilt and Community Pressure. Because we have to ask, what happens when the lived reality simply does not match that theological ideal? What happens when a family's community reputation overshadows both personal ambition and religious teaching? While distension takes a devastating emotional toll. This quote comes from the Reason on Faith blog, detailing the experience of an entirely different young woman. When she decided to formally leave her faith, her father's response wasn't rooted in theology at all. It was entirely about optics. He told her he would literally rather die than have his social standing ruined by being associated with her. He even begged her to just pretend to be a Muslim so he wouldn't lose face in the community. And that brings us to a really vital question. When you look at these harsh ultimatums, whether it's the medical school threat on Reddit or the disownment threat on the blog, are they actually about serving God, or are they simply about serving community optics? The blog author points out a deeply tragic hypocrisy. Parents who are literally demanding their children commit the religious sin of being a hypocrite just to protect the family's social reputation. Part 4. Navigating the crossroads. Let's look at some actionable advice for the young women who find themselves trapped right at this intense intersection of family, faith, and their own futures. The commenters on that original Reddit post, they were incredibly practical. They offered highly strategic advice, essentially telling the poster to use medical school as a Trojan horse. They said, look, take the offer, get onto campus, get a student job. Once you finally have a taste of independence and a little bit of your own money tucked away, you can quietly switch your major to computer science later. It's all about playing the long game, to slowly build up financial and personal autonomy. On the flip side, religious leaders offer their own roadmap for surviving university life, and it's heavily focused on internal resilience. When giving advice to students leaving home, the Ahmadiyya Khalifa urged them to deeply anchor themselves. Maintain your 5 daily prayers, study the Quran, and crucially, surround yourself with good-natured friends, even if they aren't of the exact same faith, who have strong morals. The ultimate goal is to stay grounded and quietly lead by example. When you pull all these threads together, you realize these young women are forced into an incredibly delicate, high-stakes balancing act. They have their own secular ambitions, like our poster wanting to study computer science. They have religious duties they're trying to uphold. And hanging over everything is the massive weight of intense family expectations and the ever-present anxiety about community reputation. It is, without a doubt, an exhausting tightrope walk. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider. We've seen how fear can drive parents to issue devastating ultimatums, and how institutions view education as a protective shield. But as you reflect on all of this today, ask yourself, is it truly possible to balance obedience to family and the preservation of culture with the universal, fundamental right of a young woman to actually forge her own path in the world? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.